All right, so I'm on page 404 of this biology book, and it talks about the process of speciation. It's literally going through here, evolutionary biology textbook, saying this is what happens, speciation and natural selection. These things work to bring about new species, and that is evolution. And then they show pictures. They, of course, show Darwin's finches as evidence. They go to the Galapagos Islands. They go to South America, show fish as their evidence. So they're saying, look, we've watched speciation. That is evolution. What's wrong with that?
Well, we wouldn't disagree that there's speciation, that there's variety within those kinds. And we've watched those things. So one thing that David mentioned earlier is we have to have observable, repeatable, testable results to consider something as a scientifically valid idea. So we can monitor the way that different species have changed. So if you think about the finches that the Grants have studied there in the Galapagos, they're actually the tanagers and finches and the different birds there, they can change over time. And we do see variation within them. Their beaks change, they can interbreed. We see different species on each of the islands. Those are all observable facts. But that doesn't mean that that bird evolved from a dinosaur ancestor. So they're taking what we can observe in the present and they're extrapolating it backwards on a scale that's just ridiculous. So they're saying if we see little changes today, and that was Darwin's idea, he wrote, I think, in his notebook next to this little branching diagram, that if we see these small changes today, we could track those back for millions of years and we could get enough change to create a different kind eventually, or have a common ancestor back in that distant past.
So he's looking at the present, he's looking at the evidence, but he had an assumption about how long the past had been to help him come to the conclusion that he had come to.
Yeah, and so he's starting from the thinking of long ages, which he had picked up in Hutton's and Lyell's, reading their books and talking to them. And he's taking those ideas and bringing them into this understanding of how these birds got to this island and how there are different forms of these birds. The different tortoises that were on the islands, the different lizards that he found, the iguanas there, and the different habitats they occupied. And he's taking those small changes and extrapolating them backwards. But today, using real scientific analysis and looking at the DNA, we can see that there are no mechanisms that allow for that degree of change. We can see small changes and mutations in the DNA and monitor those things, but nothing that's ever going to bring about an entirely new creature from one kind evolving into a different kind, even something as close as a dog and a cat, for example.
So when they present this and they show these small changes, and then they say and they teach the idea of the big change, is this just linguistics where they're just kind of confusing the issue, or is this no? There's a level where you have to just call it's fake science. This is not real science that is being presented as science.
Well, with any interpretation of the past, we have to acknowledge that we're going to bring our own bias into that interpretation. So we often distinguish between historical science, thinking about things in the past and evolutionary ideas and those types of things, and observational science. So we can do the observational science, and we can all agree on that. We can measure the beaks, and we can look at the DNA, and we can do the sequencing, and we can count the isotopes. All of those things are things that we can agree with the evolutionists about. But how do we interpret those things as we look back in the past? As I changed my mind from, with God changing my heart, from thinking from the billions of years perspective and looking at it more of a thousands of years perspective, like the Bible teaches, I had to admit that I had just bought into that idea and never even considered other forms of understanding and interpreting those things. And so it's really the interpretation that we start with. So they're really deceived. And so they're starting from a position of deception, and that leads to the falsehoods that they're going to make in their claims about how these organisms came to be the way they are.